In this video, we'll talk about how computers use data. We'll answer questions like what are variables, what are classes and objects, and just how do computers work with data. You're going to learn that computers store data in their memory. Data like text, numbers, files, pictures, sounds, just about anything else. So let's get started.
Have you ever heard of variables? How about integers and strings? These are just types of information. All information that a computer needs to remember is organized by what type it is and where it needs to be stored. Just like you keep track of books by their names and you put them on a shelf in a certain spot, a computer needs a name, a type, a location for everything that it knows. Data isn't just the simple things like letters and numbers, though. Computers need to keep track of data, like pictures, files, saved games, sounds, videos, and even people. Some of these types of data are built in, and some of them need to be explained to the computer first. Explaining a type of information to a computer is called creating a class. Then creating data of a certain class is called an object.
As an example, let's say I want to use Visual Studio Express to make a simple calculator. Here I have Visual C# 2008 Express Edition open. What I'll need to do is to capture two pieces of information. I need two numbers, and then I need a button so that the code can come up with a third number, the result. Let's see what that would look like. So here we have a Windows form. Here are the first two input fields. The user will type in their two numbers. When they click Calculate, we need to have some code that will perform that calculation, and then using the number that comes back, put it over here for the result. Each of these numbers will be whole numbers, and that makes them integers. Now this is what the user will see. It's not going to do anything though until there's some code behind the button.
Let's think of our memory for a moment. Imagine that every time you learn something new, we need to find a place for it in our brain, somewhere in our memory. So imagine that today at school you learned about polar bears. So this is a new piece of information and you need to find a slot for it somewhere in your brain, somewhere in your memory. Now your brain stores memories kind of like the way a file cabinet works. Imagine that the memories need to go into folders that are labeled, and then that goes into drawers that are labeled. Now in math class, you might learn about measuring around a circle, the circumference, and that goes into another folder. And after school, maybe you trade phone numbers with a new friend, and that needs to go into a slot too. Computers work in a similar way. Whenever you need a computer to remember something, you need to create a box or a slot for the information, and you need to tell the computer what kind of thing you're going to put in there. Common types of information for computers are strings of characters, like text for your name, numbers for your age, dates for your birthday. You can even store a picture of yourself by creating a box for images. Now we don't actually call these boxes. In programming they're called variables. And instead of being in your brain, these variables are stored in your computer's memory. It's a pretty good way to think about it though. When you tell the computer to store something, it needs to find a place to put it. So you set aside a spot in memory, like the folder in a file cabinet. Then you need to name the folder so you can keep track of it. Just like your brain has millions of things floating around inside, your computer's memory has a lot in there too. So you make a box, you give it a name, and you tell it what you want it to hold. Of course, strings aren't the only thing a computer needs to keep track of. A string might have digits in it, like an address, but you still can't do math with it. Even if it's a zip code, which only has numbers in it, you can't do math with it if it's a string. This is because the code that a computer uses for strings are actually different from numbers. So how do you do math? It's easy, actually. You just need to declare the slots, the variables, as holding a number. Whole numbers are called integers. That's probably a new word for you. I'll say it again. Integers. If I need to store an integer, like your age, I'll just declare that another slot will be called age and will hold an integer.
So now let's add some code to our calculator project. Remember that we'll need to create some memory slots, that is the variables, with a certain type, those are integers, and we'll need to give them names so that we can refer to them in our code. We'll start with Visual Basic using Microsoft Visual Basic 2008 Express Edition. What we're going to do is to attach some code to this button so that when they click it, it fires this code. So we'll double-click Calculate, and it automatically creates the Calculate event handler. So I've declared number 1 as integer, and I've created number 2 as integer. Now if you're wondering what the squiggly line means, we can disregard these for now. It simply indicates that we haven't used the variables yet. Now, if you had a lot of code, that could signify that there's something going on. Maybe you thought you were going to use a variable and didn't end up using it, or you spelled it differently in one place than another. But right now, we've just created them, so we can ignore that. So now that we've created our two integer variables, it's time to copy the information from the user input fields into the variables. So now we have both of the number variables being assigned to the value of what was typed into the text box number fields. The cint function exists in Visual Basic. It doesn't actually exist in C#, so we'll use a different way of doing that. But what this does is it changes the text that was typed in as a string. It changes it into an integer so that we can do math with it. Now that we've copied these values, it's time to do some math with them. So we'll create a result variable to hold that. And now result is our third integer. The dim statement is a way of stating that I want to create a variable in Visual Basic. So this statement here, it's kind of a reverse math problem. I want to take number 1 plus number 2, and whatever it equals, I want it to be assigned to the result variable, which is called text box result. And similar to the change to integer statement, what we want to do is take the text box result field and assign its text property to be equal to a string version of the result integer. Sounds like a lot of steps, doesn't it? So the result is a number, and we want it to be a string. That way we can copy it to the text field. That's all we need to do, and we now have the complete process of taking the two fields that were entered, adding them together, and then copying the result back to this field. Let's take a quick look at what that would look like in C# now. Just like before, we'll double-click on the Calculate button. And here we have the complete copy of the code converted into C#. Now it's somewhat similar, but yet you'll see a lot of little differences too, the way the commands look, especially noticing the semicolons at the end of the line. But we're ready to go now, so we're going to hit the debug button here, and all that's going to do is start the program. And then we can practice and see if it works right. We can test it out. So here's the calculator. If I put 5 and 5 and I press calculate, I should get 10. And sure enough, the answer was first converted from the two 5s were converted into numbers, they were added together, and then the number 10 was converted to a string 10 so that we could see it.
Working with files, pictures, or even animals as data is pretty similar. Define how the data looks to the computer, find a spot in memory to store it, and give it a name. Then you can store some information there. There's a lot more about how to create your variables and complicated types of data, but this should be a good start in understanding data for programming. We can go into more details in a future video.